The first punch was verbal, but the way Mark Wahlberg's chair scraped against the floor, the way his shoulders squared up like he was back on the streets of Dorchester, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was about to become something else entirely. Joy Behar had pushed a lot of buttons in her career. She'd made senators stammer. She'd reduced CEOs to silence. She'd turned A-list celebrities into stuttering messes. But she had never seen anything like what she saw in Mark Wahlberg's eyes when she asked that question. The studio went cold. The other hosts froze. And somewhere in the control room, a producer's hand hovered over the emergency cut button. Because this wasn't an interview anymore. This was a man deciding whether 30 years of anger management was worth throwing away on live television. What happens next? Hit subscribe right now, because this story is about to get very, very real. The View studio had never felt smaller. The interview started fine. Whoopi asked about his transformation for the role. Sarah mentioned the Oscar buzz. The audience was warm, receptive. Then came the turn. "Mark," Joy said, and something in her voice made everyone's spine straighten. "I want to talk about your past." Wahlberg's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What about it?" "In 1988, when you were 16 years old, you attacked 2 Vietnamese men in separate incidents. One of them you hit so hard you blinded him in one eye. You served 45 days in jail." The studio went silent. The kind of silence that feels like pressure on your eardrums. "You've talked about being a changed man, about finding God, about your redemption arc." Joy leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "But some people say that's convenient, that you've never really paid for what you did, that your fame and your money bought you a pass that a poor kid from that same neighborhood would never get." Wahlberg didn't move. For 5 full seconds, he just stared at Joy. The audience couldn't see his hands under the desk, but the other hosts could, and they were watching his fists clench and unclench, clench and unclench. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "You want to do this, Joy? You want to do this right now? On live television?" "I'm asking a legitimate question about—" "No." The word came out like a bullet. "You're not asking a question. You're making an accusation. There's a difference. And if we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it honestly, not with your loaded words and your rehearsed gotcha moments." He leaned forward, and even through the camera, viewers could feel the intensity radiating off him. "I was 16 years old. I was high on PCP. I was out of my mind. And I did something horrible. Something I've carried with me every single day for 37 years. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Wahlberg's hand shot up. "I'm not finished." The entire studio held its breath. "You want to know about paying for what I did? I did 45 days in jail, and then I spent the next 3 decades building something. Building businesses that employ thousands of people. Building a foundation that helps at-risk kids exactly like I was, find a different path. Building a career where I can use whatever platform I have to talk about second chances." His voice was rising now, the Boston accent getting thicker with each sentence. "You think I bought a pass? Lady, I've worked for everything I have. I wake up at 4 in the morning every day. I've made 70 movies. I've produced hundreds of hours of television. I've sweated and bled for every single opportunity." He stood up from his chair, and the movement was so sudden that Sarah actually flinched. "But you don't want to hear about that, do you? You don't want to hear about the drug treatment centers we've funded, the youth programs we've built, the kids we've pulled off the streets before they made the same mistakes I made. That doesn't fit your narrative." Joy found her voice. "I'm not dismissing your charity work. I'm asking whether—" "Whether what?" Wahlberg's voice boomed across the studio. "Whether a 16-year-old kid who did something terrible can become a better person? Whether someone can spend 40 years trying to make amends? Whether redemption is real?" He walked toward the panel desk, and for a moment it looked like security might intervene. 2 guards in the wings took a step forward, then stopped when a producer waved them off. "You know what I think, Joy? I think you've never had to fight for anything in your life. I think you've never been addicted, never been homeless, Never been so lost that violence seemed like the only language you knew. I think you sit up there in your comfortable chair with your comfortable life, and you judge people like me because it makes you feel superior. Joy's face had gone from flushed to pale. That's exactly what it is. Wahlberg was towering over the desk now, his presence filling the frame. You think I don't know what I did? You think I don't see that man's face every single night before I go to sleep? You think I don't wake up in cold sweats thinking about who I was and what I could have become? His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment the tough guy facade slipped to reveal something raw underneath. I was strung out on every drug you can name. I was running with gangs. I was headed straight for a coffin or a cell, and I didn't care which one came first. And then I woke up in a jail cell, coming down from the worst high of my life, and I looked in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. He paused, swallowing hard. That was the moment I decided to change. Not because I got caught, not because I was scared of prison, because I finally saw what I'd become, and it disgusted me. The audience was completely silent now. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were leaning forward, captivated by the raw honesty of what they were witnessing. Wahlberg continued, his voice steadier now. I could have been dead before I was 20. I could have spent my life in prison. I could have been another statistic from the streets of Boston. Instead, I clawed my way out. And I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of the second chance I got. Joy tried to regain control. But doesn't it bother you that I never what? Went back to prison? Wahlberg laughed bitterly. You think that would have helped anyone? You think that man would have gotten his eye back if I'd rotted in a cell for 10 years? No. The best thing I could do, the only thing I could do, was become someone better. Someone who could actually make a difference. He turned to address the audience directly. I'm not proud of what I did. I've never been proud of it. I've never tried to hide it or excuse it or explain it away. But I absolutely refuse to let it be the only thing that defines me. He pointed at Joy without looking at her. She wants you to think that's all I am. A criminal, a thug, a guy who bought his way out of consequences. But that's not the whole story. That's not even most of the story. The story is what happens after. The story is what you do with your second chance. You're very defensive about this, Joy said coldly. Which makes me wonder. Makes you wonder what? Wahlberg spun back to face her. Makes you wonder if I'm hiding something? Makes you wonder if the guilt is eating me alive? Yeah, Joy, it is. Every single day. And I use that guilt as fuel. I use it to work harder, to do more, to try to balance the scales in whatever small way I can. He slammed his hand on the desk, and the sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Several audience members jumped. One of the hosts let out an involuntary gasp. But you don't get to weaponize my redemption. You don't get to sit there and tell me that because I was a monster at 16, I'm not allowed to be a man at 55. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. Joy tried to interrupt. I never said. You said it with every word, every implication, every raised eyebrow. Wahlberg's voice was shaking now, not with fear, but with decades of suppressed rage finally finding an outlet. You know how many interviews I've done where someone brings up 1988? Hundreds, maybe thousands, and every single time I answer honestly. I don't run from it. I don't hide from it. I face it. He pointed directly at Joy, his finger inches from her face. But there's a difference between someone genuinely asking about accountability and someone trying to destroy you for entertainment. And you, Joy, you're in the second category. You don't want answers. You want blood. His voice dropped to something almost dangerous. You know what I could have done with my past? I could have hidden it. I could have paid people to bury it. I could have denied it or minimized it or blamed it on the drugs or my upbringing or the streets. Instead, I owned it. Every interview, every press junket, every time someone brings it up, and believe me, they bring it up, I say the same thing. I did something terrible, and I've spent my life trying to make it right. He stepped back, his chest heaving. So don't you dare sit there and act like you're the first person to hold me accountable. I've been holding myself accountable for 37 years. The question is, who holds you accountable, Joy? Who holds you accountable for the people you've hurt from that chair? Joy's composure was cracking. I'm just trying to have a conversation about accountability. Accountability? Wahlberg's laugh was harsh, bitter, filled with years of frustration. You want to talk about accountability? How many people have you torn down on this show over the years? How many guests have you ambushed with questions designed to humiliate them? How many careers have you damaged with your gotcha journalism? He started pacing back and forth in front of the panel desk, too agitated to stand still. I know what I did. I've known it for 37 years. But what about you, Joy? Do you know what you do? Do you go home at night and think about the people whose lives you've made harder? The careers you've damaged? The reputations you've shredded for a few extra rating points? He stopped pacing and stared directly at her. I've met guys in prison who were more honest about what they were than you are. At least they knew they were predators. You dress it up in journalism and righteousness, but underneath it all, it's the same thing. You hurt people for sport. He gestured around the studio, at the cameras, the audience, the frozen hosts. This is your accountability moment, Joy. Right here, right now. Because you picked the wrong target today. You picked someone who's actually done the work. Someone who's actually faced his demons. Someone who's not going to sit here and crumble under your righteous indignation. The other hosts were frozen. Whoopi looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Sarah was staring at her notes so intently she might burn a hole through them. The audience was completely silent. The kind of silence that happens when people witness something they know they'll remember forever. You want me to feel ashamed? I already do. Every day. But I'm not ashamed of who I've become. I'm not ashamed of the work I've done. And I'm definitely not ashamed of standing up to a bully who hides behind a desk and calls it journalism. Joy stood up. Her hands were trembling. You don't get to call me a bully. I've spent 30 years. 30 years doing what? Wahlberg cut her off. 30 years making people uncomfortable? 30 years asking questions designed to wound? 30 years sitting in judgment of people who've actually lived difficult lives? He stepped back, creating space between them. You know what the difference is between us, Joy? When I hurt someone, I spent the rest of my life trying to make amends. When you hurt someone, you call it entertainment. The words landed like a physical blow. Joy's face contorted through several emotions: anger, humiliation, something that might have been shame. I don't have to listen to this, she said, her voice shaking. No, you don't. You can walk away. You can run back to your dressing room and tell yourself you were just doing your job. You can convince yourself that I'm the bad guy here because I didn't fold when you pushed. Wahlberg's voice was steady now, controlled. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you'll know the truth. You came at someone who was already holding himself accountable, and you did it for ratings, for clicks, for content. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. Every camera in the studio was locked on the two of them. The control room had gone silent. Producers who had been ready to cut to commercial were now watching in frozen fascination. This was either going to be a career-ending disaster or the most compelling television of the year. Maybe both. Joy's hands were shaking visibly now. Her usual composure, the armor she'd worn for 30 years of confrontational interviews, had crumbled. She looked around for support from her co-hosts, but they were all avoiding her eyes. Whoopi was staring at the desk. Sarah was pretending to review notes. The newer hosts looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone. Then Joy did something unexpected. She took off her microphone. Her fingers fumbled with the clip. 3 times she tried before finally getting it loose. She set it on the desk with a clatter that echoed through the silent studio, and walked off the stage without another word. Her heels clicked against the floor, the only sound in a room that had held its breath. The camera followed her until she disappeared into the wings, and even then, nobody spoke. The studio erupted in gasps. Camera operators swung to capture her empty chair. Producers were screaming in earpieces. The remaining hosts sat in stunned silence, looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been relief. Wahlberg watched her go. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just watched. And when she was finally gone, something in his shoulders released, like a fighter who'd been bracing for a blow that never came. He turned back to face the cameras. The anger had drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like sadness, almost like regret. Not for what he'd said, but for the fact that it had to be said at all. "I didn't come here for this," he said quietly. "I came to talk about a movie, about playing a man who helped bring killers to justice, about redemption and second chances, and whether people can change." He looked at the empty chair where Joy had been sitting. "I guess we got our answer." The audience began to applaud. Slowly at first, tentative, uncertain, then building like a wave. Someone in the front row stood up, then the person next to them, then the whole section. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet, giving a standing ovation to a man who had just defended his entire life on live television. The applause went on for nearly a full minute. Some people were crying, others were cheering. The emotion in the room was almost physical. 30 years of judgment, 30 years of sideways looks and whispered comments, all finally answered with a truth that couldn't be denied. Wahlberg stood there, taking it in, and for a moment his eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. He'd spent his whole career being defined by his worst moment, and now, for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be defined by everything that came after. Whoopi finally found her voice. "Mark, I'm so sorry about—" "Don't." Wahlberg held up a hand. His voice was gentle now, the storm having passed. "Don't apologize for her. We all make our choices. She made hers. I made mine. That's all any of us can do." He sat back down in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He suddenly looked tired. Not defeated, but tired. The kind of tired that comes after you've finally said something you've been holding in for decades. Now, he took a deep breath and attempted a smile. "You want to hear about the movie? Because I gotta tell you, playing a guy who hunted down Klan members in 1966, that's actually a pretty good story." And somehow, impossibly, the interview continued. Whoopi asked about the transformation for the role. Sarah brought up the Oscar buzz. And Mark Wahlberg talked about his work like the last 15 minutes hadn't happened. Like he hadn't just won a battle he'd been fighting his entire adult life. But everyone watching knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a confrontation, but a reckoning. A man finally standing up and refusing to be defined by the worst thing he'd ever done. The clip broke the internet within minutes. Mark Wahlberg confronts Joy Behar became the top trending topic worldwide. But unlike most viral confrontations, the conversation that followed wasn't about drama. It was about redemption, about whether people can change, about the difference between accountability and persecution. Joy Behar didn't appear on The View for a week. When she returned, she offered a brief statement about respecting different perspectives, but never apologized directly. Mark Wahlberg went on to promote his movie, which earned him some of the best reviews of his career. But he never mentioned the interview again, because he didn't need to. He'd already said everything that needed to be said. What did you think of this confrontation? Was Joy out of line? Or was she asking fair questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will absolutely blow your mind.